All right, this is just a real brief screencast because I want to talk to you a little bit about primary and secondary succession. So, you've been doing the worksheet for Chapter 7, Lesson 2, all about ecological succession. And there's two basic types of ecological succession there's primary succession, and there is secondary succession. The major difference really seems to be that primary succession, you are talking about a brand new area with absolutely no soil that already exists. So, for instance, how would that happen? Well, for instance, this is an image, I don't know how recent it is, but this is an image of Mount Kilauea in Hawaii. And once all of this lava that has oozed out solidifies, all you have is rock. You have no soil yet. And so, very, very, very slowly over time, that will change as lichens are able to come in and slowly associate with those rocks and slowly break down and slowly over time build up soil, which allows other species to come in, plants and things like that. So, but the big thing here is you're starting absolutely from scratch with primary succession. Okay. There's no pre existing soil, in other words. Okay. And that's kind of the big key as to whether you have primary succession or secondary succession. Okay. Here, this is a couple years old, but for instance, this makes the news and happens occasionally. You have an underwater volcano that erupts to the point that it breaks the surface of the ocean. And so now it's a little island, a volcanic island. Whenever this happens, you have brand new land, rock solidified from a volcanic eruption, and no pre-existing soil. So this is going to be primary succession because very, very, very slowly over time, that rock will be broken down primarily, like again, by lichens and whatnot, which is about the only thing that can deal with just rock. But it's primary succession just simply because it's brand new, no pre-existing soil, and we're starting from scratch. Okay. So primary succession is brand new land, basically. Okay. Whereas secondary succession occurs because of some sort of. Okay. Sorry. I hit pause apparently accidentally. Secondary succession occurs as a result of some sort of natural disaster or disturbance. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of that. Okay, so the first one we're going to look at is Mount St. Helens. This is a volcanic mountain in Washington State. All of this is a little bit more technical than you need, but I'd like you to notice over here. So when Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, what wound up happening was the entire north face of the mountain basically collapsed and blew itself, like basically the eruption blew out the side of the blew out the north face of the mountain. And then we had this huge flow of ash called a pyroclastic flow, and that basically caused this huge superheated landslide, mudslide, etc. Why mud? Because there's also glaciers and stuff that were frozen up here at the time. And so this is just a very short sequence of photos of the actual mountain blowing itself to bits. But what happened as a result is you get something like this. This is Spirit Lake. And this is Mount St. Helens before the 1980 eruption. You can see all of these trees and, forest area. Here is Mount St. Helens. After the eruption, the north face of the mountain is gone. All of the vegetation here has been completely wiped out. I'll show you a close-up picture of Spirit Lake, but it's just kind of spooky. Basically, the pyroclastic flow just bulldozed and destroyed absolutely everything. So is this primary or secondary succession? Okay. Obviously, you can see from this image, and I don't know how long after the eruption this image was taken. That is a different mountain in the background, by the way. But there's no vegetation. Everything was basically wiped clean. It looks like a cataclysmic event happened, which it did. Okay, here's another image of Spirit Lake not long after the eruption, and it looks like somebody just threw a bunch of toothpicks down on the ground, but they are not toothpicks. These are entire tree trunks that littered the lake, and some of them are still sitting there in the lake as a result of that pyroclastic flow and massive eruption. So is this primary or secondary succession? It is secondary succession because in this area, even though the area was completely devastated, there is soil and soil components already in existence. Okay, and remember that that's kind of the major difference between is it primary or is it secondary? Okay, so species can slowly repopulate this area, and it happens more quickly in this type of succession, secondary succession, than it would in primary because there are soil components already here. Okay, so here's just a quick picture. This is Spirit Lake. More recently, you can see that there is vegetation back in the area. This is actually still a bunch of the dead tree trunks that are still in the lake, but you can see that the environment is beginning to recover. Now, 1980, that was what? 40 something years ago. Okay, so it does take time. Notice you don't have any big, tall trees on the hillsides anymore, but you do have vegetation. Okay, so this destructive event, this disruption, this that destroyed the north side of the mountain and Spirit Lake and the surrounding area, it's an example of secondary succession. Okay, there's one other that we're going to go look at that's a little bit closer to home. Okay, so y'all were probably babies, maybe, or born this year that the Bastrop County fires happened, because this was in September of 2011. And I think most of you guys were born 2010, 2011. So ask your parents and your grandparents about this, because if they've lived in the area, even if it was Lee County, they remember this because it was a huge newsmaker. Okay. This is just one of the images from the huge wildfires that occurred around Bastrop in the fall of 2011. I know from my personal experience, and probably your parents and grandparents have the same experience, driving into Bastrop now looks completely different than it did before this fire. Because as you come in on Highway 21, and you get to the point where you're getting close to Bastrop State Park and the roadhouse that's over in Bastrop and about to drop down that hill, all of that area, not all of it, but a large portion of that area was involved in this fire. And there is very little of the old growth pine trees left that were there prior to the fire. There's patches that survived, but a lot of what we were used to seeing no longer exists. Okay, I'm not really going to enlarge some of these images because they don't necessarily take me where I want to go. But if you've ever been driving into Bastrop from Austin, this is kind of coming down into Bastrop. This is Highway 21/71. Here's the exit to go to like Chili's and Home Depot and all that. Well, in 2011, you can see all of the smoke from these wildfires. Okay. Okay, so what I'm now doing is I'm looking at a map basically showing you the areas that were impacted by this fire. This is Highway 21. As you come down into Bastrop, this is Highway 71. Remember, 21 and 71 meet right in here basically like the Buc-ee's is now right about here, but all of this area was involved in this fire. And you can see, kind of according to the map and the colors, places that were heavily damaged down to light damage. Over 33,000 acres were involved. A large portion of Bastrop State Park was also involved. Bastrop State Park itself looks very different than it did before the fires. There's a lot of areas that used to have tall canopy of pine trees that's now more open land. I mean, the pines are coming back, but it looks very different. Okay, so the big question is, what kind of ecological succession do we have in Bastrop State Park after this event? This is a major disturbance in the ecosystem. We have areas that were completely burned, and the major, litmus test kind of is, do we have pre-existing soil, which would make it secondary succession, or do we have brand new land, which would make it primary succession? So even though there were certain areas that looked like a complete wasteland, this is secondary succession, okay? And so there is already soil in place, and the area typically comes back more quickly than an area involved in primary succession. You can now, it's been, 13 or 14 years since this has happened. And you can now drive through these areas and you can see a lot of young pine trees that are growing in these areas. Right after, for the first year or two, all you saw was scorched, dead trees and a bunch of nothing. But the land has slowly recovered itself. Okay, so ask your parents and grandparents what they remember about this event, because it was a big newsmaker in the area, made national news and everything. But this is another example of an ecosystem disturbance that's so major that the ecosystem kind of has to start over. And that's what primary and secondary succession really kind of are all about.